Okay, so chapter 26. Ottomans, Egypt, the Sudan, and China. All dealing again with this theme of transition from traditional culture to Western culture. Do we Westernize? Do we not? And if we do, how do we do it? So let's look at the Ottomans first. And of the three groups in this area, Ottomans, Egypt, and the Sudan, guess which one's the most important for you to know? The Ottomans. They're the biggest. So in the Ottoman Empire, we're going to look at reasons for their decline. Now, way back in chapter 21, we already kind of gave you an overview of why the Ottomans decline. And the reason for the Ottomans' decline is pretty much consistent with every other major civilization. So they decline for reasons like corruption. What else? Invasion. What else? What's that, Michael? Yes, we have heard this before. It's all the same stuff as usual. Government inefficiency, peasant rebellion, too much taxation, empire gets too big, problems with succession, yada, 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 yada. Yada. Exactly. In fact, I could probably just change most of these notes to blah, 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 blah. Which, in effect, is what it is. Weak rulers, power struggle, economic decline, military decline. Here are some of the specifics. Because of the time frame that we're now in, what's happening in Western Europe? Industrialization. Guess who has not industrialized yet? Everybody else. It starts in England, it spreads through Western Europe, which means it's spreading through European cultures. It has not crossed cultural borders yet. So what this means for everybody else in the world is suddenly all the cool stuff that they used to have that Europeans wanted is now in danger of becoming not nearly as valuable because Europeans now have the ability to produce a fair number of things, like clothing, Ottoman cotton, Indian cotton, used to be some of the most valuable cloth in the world. It still is. I mean, you still hear it when people are talking about buying sheets for their bed. Egyptian cotton sheets are the creme de la creme of bedding.
Because they take it seriously?
It's such fine quality. Yeah. And then the manufacturing of it. Once you start with a good material and you manufacture it well, the final product is really nice. You get 500 count Egyptian cotton sheets. That's fun to sleep on. But the Ottomans are having a problem because as nice as their product is, they can't compete with the pace and the efficiency of European production. The Europeans can outproduce them and do it more cheaply. And even if the Ottoman product is slightly better, which one do you think the average consumer is going to buy? Slightly better and much more expensive, or not quite as good but a whole lot cheaper? Yeah, a whole lot cheaper. You're also seeing issues with the Ottoman military. The Janissaries are a political power as well as their military force. It's true today. Our military is a political power. Our military influences what the government does. It's true in every country. When you rely on these people to defend you, you have to listen to them. And in this case, the Janissaries don't want to change. The Janissaries are convinced that they are still the elite fighting force on the planet because they were in the 15 and 1600s. There's nobody that could touch them. You know, it's very much the same as how we view our special forces today. Army Rangers, Navy SEALs, Marines. You know, we look at them as the absolute best fighting force on the planet. Now, what may happen 20 years from now is that another country, maybe like China, might find a way to outpace them, might find a way to out-technology us. And at that point, we're going to have one of two choices. We're going to have choice one, which is, wow, we fell behind. We need to change. Or option two, no, we're still the best. We're still the best. And bury our head in the sand while we continue to mumble, no, we're still the best. And that's the option that the Janissaries have chosen. No, we're still the best. And what happens is, decade after decade, they inadvertently fall further and further and further behind the West. The West is building better and better guns, better cannons, better transportation. And the Janissaries don't realize how far behind they're falling because they don't want to realize it. And because they're a political power, what do you think happens anytime an Ottoman Sultan brings up the prospect of, hey, maybe we should copy what the West is doing? What do you think the Janissaries say? No. No. Or we will overthrow you. If I hear you say that one more time that we should copy those dirty people in the West, we will kick your butt out of power so fast you won't know what happened, and we will put in a new sultan that will listen to reason and maintain tradition. So if you're an Ottoman Sultan, are you going to bring up Westernization very often? No.
Maybe once.
Maybe once and that's it, because then you're out or you're dead.
Or you will be next time.
Exactly. All right, so this is kind of the general overview of what's happening in the Ottoman Empire. Now, with that general overview being said, there are Ottoman leaders that from time to time will attempt to enact change. So we're going to run you through what some of them try to do. And I want you to look at the date ranges. Most of this isn't happening until the end of the 1700s. So in terms of time frame, what else is happening in the world at about this time? Nick?
Europe is running around with Napoleon.
Okay, this is during the French Revolution and then Napoleon's conquest. This is just after the American Revolution. And this is just before all the revolutions in Latin America. So now you've kind of got a mental picture of the chronology. So while all that stuff's happening, the Ottomans are now beginning to wrestle with this idea of Westernization. And so this particular Sultan, Selim III, does want to Westernize a little bit. He brings in the printing press, which is not new technology. I mean, that was in China in the 11th and 12th and 13th century. It came to Europe in the 14th and 15th century. He brings it to the Ottoman Empire now in the 18th century in an attempt to increase literacy. And what's the connection between printing press and literacy?
Easier production of books.
Right. If it's easier to produce books, there are more books. If there are more books, books are cheaper. If books are cheaper, what's probably going to happen? More people will buy them. And is there a point in having a book if you can't read? No. But now people will learn to read because they can get books, because learning is cool, which is why you're all here. Exactly. Now, he does want to try to build a more modern army and navy, but what's the problem? The Janissaries. He also wants to restructure the bureaucracy. He wants to westernize his government. What do you think the problem is there? Not only the Janissaries, but who else is going to have an issue with that? The people that are already in the bureaucracy. Do you think they want to lose their jobs? Do you think they want to have to do their job radically differently? Do you think they want to be replaced by somebody that can do their job better? No. So he is not terribly successful. And then we see a gap from 1807 to 1826, which tells us that whoever was in power was probably just trying to keep their head down and not rock the boat. But then we have another Sultan, Selim III. S-E-L-I-M. M. So then we go to Mahmud. Mahmud II. And if you notice, he's not in power very long. But Mahmud is actually able to build a Western-style army. How on earth does he accomplish this? All right. He builds a secret army. He recruits soldiers and trains them with Western weapons and Western tactics in secret. And then, knowing that a face-to-face conflict with the Janissaries is not a good idea, it's going to get ugly, it's going to get bloody, what he decides to do is a little bit of trickery. And so what he does is he enlists the help of a spy, and that spy goes into the Janissaries' barracks, where all the soldiers live, where they eat, where they sleep, and during dinner, they're all crowded around these big, huge pots of food, stew or something. And, soldiers like to eat. They like their 3 meals a day. It's about dinner time. They're all hungry. They're getting excited about the food. And the Sultan's spy accidentally knocks over an entire kettle of food. What do you think the reaction is to that? Oh, he's going to get punched. So a fight breaks out. It's a good old-fashioned brawl. Like, one punch gets thrown, somebody else gets punched. It turns into like a cartoon fight where like he misses somebody and punches somebody else. And he's like, hey, what was that? And he punches somebody else. Before you know it, there's like 50 people just brawling in the barracks. And there's so much fighting. Somebody gets thrown out a window, somebody gets kicked through the door, and the fight spills outside. And they find themselves surrounded by about 200 members of the new military that the Sultan has secretly created. So he starts this fight in order to take advantage of the Janissaries when they're not prepared to fight back. And so they all spill outside. They're not carrying their guns. They're not ready for an actual shootout. And so the majority of the Janissaries are either arrested or slaughtered, along with most of their families. So this is how they're able to install, finally, a new Western-style military and at the same time virtually eliminate the political power of the Janissaries. Nick?
So in the political power aspect, is the Janissaries a lot like the Praetorian Guard?
Yeah. Yeah, very similar to the Praetorian Guard. Now, once you got the military on your side, it gives you more flexibility. Now you can exchange ambassadors and advisors with the West and try to get more direct contact, get more ideas, get more goods. And this is what leads to the Tanzanite Reforms. Now, I'm guessing this is going to remind you of another official set of reforms that we studied earlier. And I think I heard somebody say it already. The Taika Reforms, which happened when? Nice! 646 in Japan. Wow. Well done, guys. Tanzanite reforms are very similar. It's an attempt to completely and radically alter culture, society, government, etc., etc. So we're going to bring in a Western-style university system of education. We're going to bring in Western-style infrastructure. So postal system, telegraph system, roads, railroads, all of that. We're going to bring in a new constitution that is influenced by Western constitutions, like England's, like the United States, like France's under the Napoleonic Code. Tanzimat. Yep. We're going to open unrestricted trade with the West and bring in as many of their manufactured goods as they are willing to sell us. Is that a good idea? Or is it an idea with both good and bad components?
Good and bad.
Okay, what's the upside?
They get a lot of stuff they can use to improve the living quality and stuff.
Okay, you get a lot of stuff you can use to improve the quality of life. And are these goods expensive?
Yeah.
No, because they're coming from the West, who's industrialized. So these are relatively affordable goods because they're so cheaply produced. Nick?
It also helps you remain on par in the West for any diplomatic things.
Right? Keeps you in the West's good graces because you're buying their stuff.
But now they think you're a bit
but now you become reliant on them, especially because this is having a negative impact on your own industry. When you start buying goods from the West, who are you not buying goods from? Your own craftspeople. And when you start flooding your own market with foreign goods, guess what people are not buying? Right, stuff that's made in the Ottoman Empire, which means now those people are losing money, potentially lose their jobs, which means you are now even more dependent on the West. And like we said on the reading quiz, we are going to discuss, as part of the Tanzanite Reforms, the rights of women. We're going to discuss eliminating polygamy. We're going to discuss eliminating the practice of veiling women. We're going to discuss getting rid of the practice of maintaining a harem for the upper class men. We're going to discuss all these things, but we're not quite ready yet. Too much change. We don't want to overdo it, so we'll hold off on changing the rights of women. They're patient. They'll understand.
What's that word on the second last line? Yeah. Open,
Unrestricted
trade.
with West. And then we'll cut to the end. The Ottoman Empire, as an empire, collapses in 1908, and it's actually replaced with a republic, led by a group of young, middle-class ideologues, we'll call them, called the Young Turks. And the Young Turks have all of these wonderful ideas about representative government, about Westernization, about revitalizing the economy, but they sadly never really get a chance to get the ball rolling, because what happens not too long after 1908? World War I. And the Ottomans, unfortunately, picked the wrong side. They picked the most logical side, but they picked the wrong side in World War I, and they allied themselves with Germany. Now, we got March Madness coming up, NCAA tournament. When you do your brackets, people like to pick upsets. But you always find yourself wondering, how do I not pick the number one seed? The number one seed is always a logical choice. That's why they're the number one seed. That was Germany going into World War I. They were the clear number one seed. Nobody was even close. So who would you pick if you needed an ally? Germany. It's a no-brainer. Nick?
Did the Germans do any subversive measures to try and get the Ottomans to join their cause?
I have no idea. It's possible.
Because I seem to remember that shortly before the Ottomans joined the Germans, a German ship or two showed safe haven in the Ottoman ports from the British.
Certainly possible. I couldn't tell you, but the Ottoman Empire was also a source of competition and conflict between Russia, England, Germany. So there were all kinds of levels of diplomacy and competition taking place. One second, Hannah?
What's the difference between a republic and a democracy?
At its purest level, democracy implies that everybody has a vote. A republic is when you elect the people that then vote for you.
Okay.
So we are technically more of a republic because we vote for our senators, we vote for our president, and then they take care of the day-to-day stuff.
Okay.
It's like nobody called me up and asked me about the sequester and whether or not it's a good idea. Like, they just let that happen.
But,
David?
but then you have the issue of when you go through representative vote stuff, then you have that odd issue where the popular vote is different from the
Because it's impossible to represent everybody with a small section of society.
Yeah, like,
Exactly.
I mean, like, one is greater than the other, and one tries to be opposite of the other.
Yep.
Which was the most recent election like that again?
Where the popular vote and the electoral vote differed,
Yeah.
that was 2000, Bush v. Gore.
Right. Okay. And the young Turks were middle class, what now?
I mean, you can call them ideologues, people with very idealistic beliefs. Okay, fun with pictures. Where are we? Egypt. Good. How'd you figure that out? Because of the pyramids. Okay. And based on the flag down here,
It's French.
this is the French invasion. This is the Battle of the Pyramids. Now, this is just a visual introduction to our next region, which is Egypt. Now, another funny story. So, Napoleon. Before Napoleon gets his start conquering Europe, Napoleon, under the orders of the revolutionary government, goes to Egypt. Now, there has been all sorts of scholarly debate as to why he went there. And there are a variety of reasons. Some people say that he was going to the Middle East in order to disrupt England's access to India. In other words, trying to put a giant hurdle halfway between England and India. There are other scholars that swear up and down that Napoleon was actually going to Egypt in search of occult knowledge, magic. That he believed that the Egyptians had mysterious powers long since forgotten by modern man, and if he could harness those, he could truly achieve his goal of world domination. You are welcome to take it either way. I have heard both by any number of very serious people. This is not one of the times I'm lying to you, I think. Alia?
Do they, like, do some people speak French in Egypt?
Uh-huh.
Like,
Mm-hmm. Not very. All right, so Napoleon invades. This is funny, if you're French. Napoleon invades Egypt, and in order to invade Egypt, he must fight the Mamluks. Now, the Mamluks are famous for being the only civilization to go head-to-head with the Mongols and win.
Are they like slaves?
The Mamluks started as slaves that rebelled against their Egyptian masters and took power and created an empire in Egypt. And when the Mongols invaded in the late 1200s, the Mamelukes soundly defeated them. Now, to be fair, they were only fighting against one of the Mongol armies and not the combined might of the entire empire, but they smoked them because they fought the same way. They were cavalry-based, they were light cavalry, they moved quickly, they used a lot of the same tactics of, retreat, withdrawal, flanking, etc., etc. They were awesome. But like with the Janissaries, they continued to believe they were awesome long after they stopped being awesome. And so when Napoleon lands on the coast of Egypt and begins to offload his military and bring in the cannons, and his soldiers are marching in with their muskets, the Mamelukes ride out to, kick him out. Still on horseback, still carrying swords and spears and bows. And this is about as one-sided a fight as you're ever going to see. The Mamelukes get utterly crushed by Napoleon's relatively small army. This sends shockwaves throughout the Muslim world because it's no longer possible to pretend that the West sucks and the Ottomans and the Mamelukes and everybody else in the Middle East are still the superior military force on the planet. They get annihilated. And this forces them to reconsider clinging to tradition the way that they have. Right. And then the British sail in and crush Napoleon, and then, and that's where it gets kind of funny too. But for the Europeans, though, this is kind of a wake-up call for them as well, because Europeans had also been operating under the assumption that the Middle East was truly powerful. It's almost like that schoolyard bully in elementary school. The kid that was always bigger than you because you were like this big and he was this big. And he got facial hair at like 7 and it was weird. And so he was always taking your lunch money. And so you just develop this psychological, mentality of, he could always beat me up. I am never going to be stronger than him. And so even as you both continue to age and you grow and he grows, even if you got a little bit bigger, you would still have this psychological block. He's bigger than me. He's tougher than me. Until, let's say, you both get to high school and you get in a little bit of a fight. All of a sudden you push him and he goes flying. And you're like, wow. Like, was there a spider that bit me? Like, what just happened? Suddenly you are brought to the very, very obvious and abrupt conclusion. I'm strong and he's not anymore. Like, this just shakes up my entire world. Everything I thought I knew to be true is now turned upside down. I am, in fact, the stronger one. This is what happens to Europe when Napoleon defeats the Mamluks. It finally blasts through this myth that the Middle East is more powerful. Because that's been true all the way back to the Crusades. I mean, other than the first crusade that was mildly successful, the Europeans' efforts in the Crusades were sad. And then they were forced to sail around the Ottomans because they knew the Ottomans were stronger than them. Which is why Da Gama goes around Africa and Columbus goes west. They're like, we're going to go as far away from you people as possible because you're too strong. And now all of a sudden they actually get this fight. And Europe is brought face to face with the reality of just how much stronger they've gotten and how far behind the Middle East has fallen. So now what do you think Europeans are thinking? Open season. Open season on the Middle East. We can now exert our will. For the Middle East, this is likewise a wake-up call. We need to change. Now, in Egypt, you were going to have a leader by the name of Muhammad Ali. Again, not the boxer. Muhammad Ali takes power in Egypt and attempts to westernize, attempts to catch up to the West. He wants to create a Western-style military, and he does, with Western weapons. And here again, we come back to that same issue of, if you give a man a fish, he eats for a day. If you teach a man to fish, he eats for a lifetime and stops buying your fish. And this is what happens in Egypt. The West is happy to sell small numbers of modern weapons to Ali. But what are they not willing to give him? Their secrets, the technology to make the weapons himself. Because if they give him the technology to do it himself, what happens? He does it himself. He stops buying Western weapons and starts buying raw materials and might even then surpass the West again. And Ali is incredibly frustrated by this fact. He leaves power and dies an incredibly frustrated man that he was not able to industrialize his nation. He was incredibly frustrated by the Europeans' refusal to give him industrial knowledge rather than industrial goods. Because without that industrial knowledge, what's going to happen in the Ottoman Empire and Egypt? All right, they're going to stay behind. And the West will continue to be able to dominate them. Which is exactly what the West wants. Now we have one stop left on our Middle Eastern tour. We're going to talk very, very briefly about the Sudan, which is just south of Egypt.
What does Sudan need? Because he needs violence, right? He needs North
Well, Sudan becomes a country. For a while, it's referred to as a region. Eventually, becomes its own political entity.
And now it's Sudan itself.
And now it's Sudan and South Sudan, which is the newest country on the planet.
How long ago?
Last year?
Yeah, no, 2011.
Oh, that's right. It's 2013 now. Okay. So yeah, technically, but not quite 2 calendar years ago, because I think it was July of 2011. Yeah. Okay. So, oh, sorry, we're not in the Sudan yet. This is the part that typically gets very confusing in the textbook. So here is an abridged version of what happens next. Muhammad Ali in Egypt was a very insightful, charismatic ruler. The people that came after him sucked. This is a little bit like the Ottomans, where you had Suleiman the Magnificent, who was magnificent, and then everybody else who came after him sucked. So the Khedives is the group title we give to the people that ruled after Muhammad Ali.
How do you spell it?
K-H-E dives.
K-H-E-D-I-V-E-S.
Yeah. They were not able to do the things that Ali did. Lack of personality, lack of ability to motivate people, totally selfish and greedy, variety of reasons. Ali puts together the beginnings of a great empire. These guys take it over, and what do? They do the same thing that has happened in pretty much every other civilization. They sit down, they focus totally on themselves and all of the wealth that is now at their disposal, and they allow everything else to just kind of take care of itself. The one cool thing that happens is that during the rule of the Khedives, the Suez Canal is constructed. The Suez Canal is a huge deal for a variety of reasons. One, it is an amazing physical undertaking. Now, keep in mind, Egypt has not industrialized. How do you build a canal if you haven't industrialized? You give shovels to a lot of dudes, and you have them dig a hole.
Has industrialized.
What, Nick?
Or you do it to someone who has industrialized, like Great Britain.
Right, but Britain's not going to get involved till the end, because why would they? Because they're working on it themselves. So you line up a whole bunch of guys, you give them a whole bunch of shovels, and you tell them dig. And they do. And that's what it looks like today. In terms of length, I don't know how many miles. Oh, deep? Deep enough for an aircraft carrier. An aircraft carrier would look about like this in scale. A few thousand feet. Probably a helicopter. Now, the reason why this is such a big deal, and we'll come back to this page in just a second, so don't freak out. This is why the Suez Canal is such a big deal. Before the Suez Canal, if you want to go from Europe to India, where do you go? You go around Africa. Or you go overland, which is still slow because you're going through desert. The Suez Canal allows constant water transport in about half the time. This trip takes 2 months. This trip takes less than 2 weeks. Tarina?
So, but if the Europeans were in control, what if they not?
Well, the Europeans weren't in control at first, and so the Sudanese people actually thought this might be a way we can get ahead. Because if we control this canal, what can we do to every single ship that wants to take our shortcut? We can tax them. And because this is cutting their trip by more than half, they are willing to pay us a lot of money to save that time and that cost. The problem is they go bankrupt before they can finish the canal. Their economy could not support the construction. And guess who graciously comes in and finances the remainder and then maintains ownership? The British. which obviously does not sit well with the Sudanese people. They're a little cranky about that. And so you end up with a rebellion to attempt to remove Western influence and Westerners. And we've seen this fairly often, especially in China. When things get bad, where do people look for solutions? One option is religion. Option 2 is the past. When things aren't good now, most people can't look into the future and go, oh, well, in 12 years it's going to be fine, don't worry. When things get bad, most people look backwards and problem solve. When were things good? What went wrong? And we've talked about this before. You get this nostalgic perspective. You see it with relationships. You see it with where people have lived. You get far enough past it and you look back, you're like, oh, that was so good. That relationship was awesome. Except you forget that when you were there 5 years ago, you're like, wow, that person's crazy. This has to end. 5 years later, you're looking back, oh, we had so much fun. That was so great. Or you've moved because 5 years ago, you're like, I can't stand this place anymore. This is a hellhole. 5 years later, you're like, oh, it was so cute and quaint. Had so much character and charm. Like, this is what human beings do by nature. We get nostalgic. We lose track of the negative. We tend to glamorize the positive. And this is what societies do. When things get tough, we tend to look backwards. When were we great? You hear this with, like, grandparents all the time. Back when I was a kid, life was good. Candy was a penny. Gas was a quarter. Life was good then. If only we could go back to then kids would behave themselves and we wouldn't have problems with drugs and gangs and all that YouTube nonsense. I don't know. I'm making stuff up. It's Friday. I'm tired. No, it's not going to happen. Tarina, really no laughter, but jump backwards. It gets a... Seriously, I quit. I'm done. I'm out. Teach yourselves. I'm done.
All right.
So this is what's happening, not only in the Ottoman Empire, but also in Egypt and even in the Sudan. They recognize they're in trouble. They recognize that they're threatened. How do we fix it? How do we solve this? Let's look to our past, to when we were great. And let's do things the way that we did them when we were great. By the way, life lesson, that doesn't always work well. Oftentimes there are reasons that relationship was bad. Oftentimes there are reasons why that place was not good and you left. Sometimes nostalgia is not good.
About the Suez Canal, how does it compare to the Panama Canal in stuff like how tough, how long, how hard it was to complete it?
It's not really a fair comparison because when the United States builds the Panama Canal, the United States is an industrialized nation. And so the United States has all the benefits of the most modern technology at the time in order to construct it. Now, the Panama Canal is longer, and there are more severe changes in elevation than the Suez Canal had to deal with. But the Suez Canal is being largely dug with men with shovels. So I'm not really sure how to answer the question which one was harder.
You have to look at what technology was.
Right.
And budget.
Right. All right. One other quick thing to talk about, just so you're not confused by it. The modest revolt, not modest like M-O-D-E-S-T, like humble, but modest as in Mahdi. The Mahdi was a religious leader that leads a faction of people that want to go backwards, that want to go back to the good old days of traditionalist, kind of fundamental religious culture. And his followers start to believe that he is actually the second coming of Muhammad. And he's one of those unique individuals who, through a combination of luck and skill, is incredibly successful at the beginning, which only adds to his reputation as this sort of mystical, magical spiritual leader. His followers begin to believe that they are impervious to bullets, that they cannot be threatened by Western weapons because they are doing God's work, that this is God's will and God will protect them. And so in the short term, this is a very powerful religious movement. In the long term, it really just helps to divide Egypt and make life even easier for the Europeans. But it shows you that tension in these societies in the Middle East. They're so desperate to fix their problem, and you almost see them move to extremes. You've got the people that are so absolutely convinced that the only way to fix their problem is to go backwards. And then you've got the people that are so absolutely convinced that the only way to fix their problem is to become totally Western and abandon as much of their current culture as possible. And so the revolt led by the Mahdi and his followers is just a good example of that sort of traditionalist action taking place. And I realize physical gestures don't translate well in the audio, but deal with it. All right. Did we miss a slide? Okay. China. You want to keep going, or you guys want to break to work on your own stuff for a little bit? All right, democracy in action. How many people say keep going? Oh, you're going to make me count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Interesting. How many people say time for a break? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. You lose by 2.
How many don't care?
Hey, abstention is always an option.
It does.
All right, well then here's what we're going to do. I'm just going to tell you the best story now, and then we'll stop. And then we'll come back and we'll do all this next class. All right, condensed version. China's dealing with the same problems as everybody else. They thought they were better than the West. They are forcibly shown that they are not. And here's what happens. For centuries, Europeans have been trying to get into China to trade. And what was always the problem? Chinese had better stuff. The Chinese didn't want to trade. The only thing of value that the Chinese wanted from Europeans was what?
Precious metal.
Gold and silver. And that was the one thing Europeans traditionally did not want to trade. So they're always trying to find a new product that they could give. That's why they were so psyched about the Americas. They're like, oh, maybe we can find something here. We can finally trade to the Chinese so that we can get their stuff.
Nope, it's not.
Not really. Until the British colonize India. And in addition to the cotton fields in India, they also find a very, very valuable natural resource. Poppies. And poppies can be turned into opium, which is a highly addictive narcotic. Yeah. Opiate. I don't know if it's a you guys probably know more because you're in health class. Barbiturate, opiate. Question, David?
Are poppies illegal to grow here?
That's a good question. I'm not sure. I don't know. The poppy itself is probably fine. It's just if you turn it into something illegal.
Okay.
Because poppies themselves are not a narcotic.
Okay, but like you have poppy seed big,
Right, totally fine.
but you still own that blood pressure.
It usually doesn't make a huge difference.
Unless you have like quite a few.
Unless you have like 5 of them, which is not recommended for cholesterol reasons, but you know. Okay, so short version of this story then. The British start growing acres of poppies in India, which, geographically speaking, right next door to China. And then they process the poppies, turn it into opium, which was a very popular drug already. But it was a drug that was not only illegal in England, but was illegal in China. The British, undeterred, start to smuggle opium across the border into China because the Chinese had refused to trade with the British. And so they get thousands of locals addicted to opium. And as you guys learn in health class, when you get addicted to something, when you become an addict, your body chemically craves that drug. And when it gets bad enough, you are willing to do just about anything to get more of that drug. Up to and including selling stuff to people that you're not supposed to be selling to. And so you get people throughout rural villages all over China that start engaging in trade with the British in order to get more opium. So the British have finally found their trade good. Now, the Chinese government is outraged, and they demand... What's that? Uh-huh. Do what? Oh, yeah, they knew. But they deny it left, right, and center. So this is a drug trade. And when the Chinese government complains to England and says, I can't believe you're doing this, this is an outrage, you absolutely have to stop and cease this drug trafficking, the British are like, what drug trafficking? We wouldn't do that. Opium's illegal in our country. We wouldn't bring it into your country. There were warehouses full of opium in China, just serving as distribution centers. And so finally the Chinese emperor takes his most trusted advisor and he sends him to the British and he tells them, go fix this. This has to stop. We cannot abide by this. And so his advisor, and his name escapes me at the moment, his advisor goes down to try to negotiate with the British, and the British are still stonewalling him. They're like, yeah, we don't know what you're talking about. What drug trade? That warehouse? Oh, that's cotton. So a little bit later, that Chinese official sets the thing on fire. Burns it down with all the cotton, opium, inside. And now the British are just outraged. Because, I mean, this is hundreds of thousands, if not millions of pounds is in currency. Dollars, pounds, British pounds. Millions of dollars worth of opium. But how do you complain? Because you've already stated quite clearly that you're not doing this thing that you have just lost. So you keep the complaints generic, but you just burned down our warehouse. Oh, really? What was in it? You just burned down our warehouse. Filled with what? Never mind, you burned down our warehouse. Unacceptable. Long story short, this back and forth eventually turns into an actual physical confrontation between the British Navy and the Chinese Navy. Now, you remember those treasure junks? Zheng He? Most amazing ships ever? Yeah, those treasure junks don't fare so well against the British Royal Navy, since the British Royal Navy has ironclad battleships. Chinese Junko Boom.
Didn't the Chinese outlaw? I was reading in a book. It was not this history book, it was a different one, but it said the Chinese outlawed all ships with more than 2 sails by 1525.
Yeah.
2 masts.
Yeah. So, long story short, this opium war is lost by the Chinese. They can't compete militarily. And so they have 2 options: fight to the death and lose, or surrender and lose. So they surrender. And the treaty that they are forced to sign, which is called the Treaty of Nanjing, does a couple very unpleasant things to China. One, it's humiliating, because China has now lost, much like the Mamelukes lost Napoleon. It's just embarrassing, because they thought they were awesome. The second thing it does is it grants Europeans something called extraterritorial rights, which means that Europeans in China do not have to abide by Chinese law. Right. So it's almost like diplomatic immunity.
They're restricted by, are they restricted by?
They're restricted by the laws of their own country
While in China.
while in China. But it's not like any English court is going to prosecute any British person for doing something in China. Because
So they can just go running around murdering and raping people.
And the third thing it does is it cedes control of Hong Kong to the British until 1997.
Recently.
Yeah, we're
So
back to the Tricon.
about 150 years worth of control of one of China's most lucrative trading ports is given entirely to the British, which is why if you go to Hong Kong today, you could easily mistake it for a Western capital city. Most people speak English. Most people drive cars that you would find here. They wear Western-style three-piece suits. You could easily confuse it for New York or Los Angeles or London. And it wasn't until 1997 that China got control of it back. And I know you guys were wee tiny in 1997, but the fireworks show that the Chinese put on when they got Hong Kong back was bigger than the one for the Beijing Olympics. Nick?
Now, why did, in 1997, even though it was written in the treaty, why were the British so quick to abandon all the people who were seeking safe haven from the Chinese government who were hiding in Hong Kong?
I don't know for sure, but I think part of it was it was politically incorrect by this time for the British to be controlling Hong Kong like that. It's like how British and Argentina are still fighting over the Falklands. Like it's just not cool anymore to be an imperial nation.